Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me for today's presentation, Chapter 5, Scope of the Project Management Professional, PMP Exam Certification Preparations. My name is Michel Zibara, and without further ado, we are going to go through that presentation, which is the foundation of the PMP course. That is the building block where all the entire chapters, the subsequent chapters, will be built on top of that scope management chapter. The fundamentals and the principles of scope management chapter 5, are the below, but not limited to only the below, but that's the major principles and fundamentals which we are going to go through in today's presentation. First one is product scope. There is a big confusion between the product scope and the project scope. Sometimes these terms are mistakenly used and they are interchangeably used, and that's not the ideal case. So the product scope is mainly the requirements that relate to the product, the service, or the end result of the project. So what is that project going to produce for me? As an example, let's say a phone company is producing a new release of a phone model. The product scope in that case is the new phone. Let's say Samsung S11, for instance, right? So the product scope is the Samsung S11 with the new features and the specifications included in that phone. That's the product scope. The project scope is the work done to be able to deliver the product scope, to deliver that phone. So in other terms, it includes the planning, the coordination, and the management activities that ensure the product scope is achieved, which is in that case the example which I've given, which is the phone, Samsung S11, right? It could be a new building, it could be a train, it could be a new parking hall, it could be different end products or product scopes. Scope management process is detailed as below, but also that covers the main components of the scope management process, but not everything. So the majority of the components, right? The key components. So first of all, in the scope management process, we aim to develop a plan for how we are going to plan, validate, and control the scope and requirements on the project. We all know the scope. The term scope, in other words, let's go to the basics. Sometimes you've heard, for example, microscope, right? Microscope, everybody is familiar with that term. It shows you the boundaries. So the scope is the boundaries. Like sometimes you on a slide, you have some, for example, if you are working in a lab, some blood types, and then you observe them in a microscope. You observe the boundaries of the red blood cells or any type of cells which need to be observed by a microscope. So the scope is mainly a boundary, the definition of the boundary of the requirements on the project. So that's at a very high level, the basics of the scope. So the scope management process is a process for how to manage these boundaries, how to plan for these boundaries, how to elicit the requirements, how to ensure they all support the project objectives and the business cases. How am I going to balance competent needs from stakeholders to determine the scope, right? Every stakeholder have their own requirements. So balancing, eliciting, analyzing, and balancing these needs are essential to define the scope. Creating the WBS and WBS dictionary is also, we are going to discuss, because WBS is the work breakdown structure, and it's a very important concept in the scope management and in the planning phase of the project. So creating a WBS and a WBS dictionary aim at helping and defining the scope during the planning. Of course, scope management includes how am I going to obtain validation. Validation is the signed acceptance of the deliverables of the project, making sure they meet the project requirements and that they are acceptable by the customer or sponsor / key stakeholders. That's part of the validate scope, and scope validation, mainly the action happens during the direct and execute phase, during the control and monitoring phase of the project. Of course, measuring scope performance and adjusted as needed. First of all, we need to have a properly defined scope. Without a proper defined scope, the project will be cumbersome and there will be a lot of conflicts, there will be a lot of change requests on the project. So the key, that's why I said scope management chapter is the foundation. If you plan properly, if you do your planning properly, and amongst that planning is the scope management plan, you do that properly, your entire project will run seamlessly and flawless. That is the key, and that's the foundation of the PMP course and any other project. So if I properly define, if I properly do my homework, which is the scope management process, and I have a proper scope management plan, which we are going to discuss later in further slides. Also, the scope management process addresses how the measurement of the scope performance is going to take place and how adjustments as needed is going to take place. The action, the measure scope performance and adjust as needed takes place in the control and monitoring phase of the project, and that's the control scope, right? Scope management plan. Again, we are talking here about the scope and the requirement management plans, which are both sub-plans of the project management plan. So we have a holistic, we said in the planning phase, before the kickoff meeting, we obtain a realistic and well-detailed and signed off, as project manager, we get that project management plan signed off by the sponsor. That scope management plan includes a lot of sub-plans. Among them is the scope management plan, and the scope management plan here provides direction on how the project and the product scope will be defined, managed, and controlled. So all of that is during the planning on how I am going to define the scope, how I'm going to manage and control that scope. Scope management plan is the primary output of the plan scope management process. We said in project management, the entire framework is built upon inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs. Tools and techniques are, as the name indicates, tools applied to the inputs in order to achieve certain outputs as part of the process. As an example, let's say you want to tile your bathroom. Okay, of course you need tiles, you need to cast the tiles, you need to level the tiles, probably you would need a level, you would need the tools to construct and tile your bathroom. So all of these are inputs, and then you would need the tools. What are the tools? You enter the warehouse, of course you would need a hammer, you would need the construction tools that you would use to be able to gain or attain an output which is a tiled bathroom in that case. Okay, so talking about the scope management plan here, we have three parts which detail how scope will be planned, executed, and controlled as per below. First of all, achieve the overall project scope. Okay, we need to achieve the project scope. Scope management plan main target is to be able to achieve the project scope. Okay, create the WBS, which is the work breakdown structure, or the product log. So WBS is used in predictive lifecycle approaches. Product backlog is used in adaptive or iterative lifecycle approaches, right? And stories. So WBS mainly uses decomposition. We're gonna go about it. just quickly at a very high level, decomposition of the project into levels, and every sub-level depends on the level before until you reach the smallest manageable deliverable, not activity, pay attention, the smallest manageable deliverable, which then in the schedule management chapter 6 is going to be divided into activities where you will have your project schedule. But now in planning, the WBS is the decomposition of levels and sub-levels depending on higher levels up until you reach the work package or the smallest manageable deliverable on the project, which is part of the planning. We are still here discussing the planning, right? Pay attention to that. No execution yet, no execution still. It's all about the planning. Manage and control scope to the project management plan. We have discussed that the scope management plan addresses how to manage and control your scope. Of course, controlling your scope, being proactive against changes and making sure to prevent changes on the project is very important. If not, then you have to raise it through raise the change request and perform the integrated change control process in order to make sure the WBS and the entire, you would go again to the project charter and update the project documents accordingly, including the WBS with the change. And the final one is to obtain acceptance of the deliverables. Other fundamentals, product backlog. That term is used in Agile. In Agile, you do not have, you mainly have a product backlog or what you've heard about grooming the backlog of the project. So it's a list of what is supposed to be done on the project. Whatever is going to be completed will be removed from that list. That list is prioritized by the business value. The highest business value stories are listed at the top of the product backlog. The ones with the highest risk, so risks and business value ranks the stories in the product backlog. And definitely they are reviewed by the teams to make sure that all the risks are covered. Product roadmap. The product roadmap is a graphical visual representation of the product releases. So in agile deliveries or adaptive lifecycle projects, the project is delivered incrementally in releases. So every release is a set of iterations, as we discussed in previous presentations. Iterations / sprints. You might have heard about the two terminologies. And so the product roadmap shows the releases, and some of the product roadmaps shows more details about the iterations and the sprints within these releases. So you have heard about release 0, then release 1, 2, 3, 4 in agile project management. Requirement management plan address the methods intended to be used to identify requirements, analyze, prioritize, and manage and track changes. So the requirement management plan addresses the methods intended to be used to identify requirements, analyze, prioritize, and manage their changes. And that's crystal clear, and it is discussed more in the course which I've posted under my playlist, which is the PMI PBA course, right? So that plays an important role also in the scope management. That's an important scope management fundamental. Requirements gathering, a little bit more about the requirements gathering, or what is called by eliciting requirements, analyzing the requirements, prioritizing the requirements. You know, these are all important. Validating the requirements, obtaining sign-off on the requirements. So here we are in that slide. We are going to discuss the main output of the requirement gathering or the collect requirements process, which is two main outputs. They are the requirements document and the requirement traceability matrix. For these two outputs, of course, we have inputs, as we said. The process always involves inputs, tools and techniques, working, shuffling, maintaining, working on these inputs to be able to achieve an end result or an output of the process. Project charter is one of the inputs. Assumption log is another input. Stakeholder register, agreements, organization, process assets. Okay, you do not need to memorize them. You need to logically understand them. Without a business case, there is no project charter. So the input to the output of project charter is the business case. The business case have a set of objectives, has a description of why the project is needed or undertaken, business objectives, project objectives, risks, constraints, assumptions. The project charter uses all of the business case components to be able to detail more the need for the project manager and the project, right? So definitely to get the to be able to achieve the requirement document, you need to use the project charter. Assumption log, also the same thing. There might be some assumptions on the project that will eventually influence the requirement traceability matrix and the requirement documents, such as output, The stakeholder register, of course, the stakeholders, all the requirements come, they are elicited and analyzed from the stakeholders through different tools and techniques, which we're going to discuss in the next bullet point. Agreements, set agreements, of course, they will influence the requirements and the organization process assets. Okay, political, economical, sociological, technical, legal, environmental, all of these are organization process assets, external and internal. Collect requirements, tools and techniques. So we've discussed the outputs, we've discussed the inputs. Now what are the tools and techniques to be able to help obtain the outputs, which are the requirement documents and the requirement traceability matrix. Brainstorming, everybody is familiar with brainstorming, a very important tool and technique where everybody is summed up to be in one room. They share their ideas and they build on top of each other's ideas. Brainstorming is not just sharing ideas. Brainstorming is creatively and innovatively building upon each other member present in the meeting. They have valid ideas, they raise ideas, and then other members build on top of these ideas. So brainstorming is mainly used in combination or in conjunction with nominal voting. That's another. They can be in most of the brainstorming sessions. They are used with these two techniques are used together. Interviews, they can be a one-to-one interview, a group interview. It could be, they are also very important to elicit and analyze requirements. Focus groups, it's a bit bigger than the interviews in terms of the numbers. They use moderators in the focus groups. There is a moderator and all of them are subject matter experts, or they have used that product before and they share their ideas in such type of technique. Questionnaires and surveys, they are closed-ended questions issued to a large community, probably because of distance or probably because some feedback need to be generated from a large community and gather these requirements. So that's one of the techniques. Benchmarking is mainly the other term of benchmarking is competition. You see what the market is producing, what other organizations are using, and you use the same to be able to produce requirements in your organization and on your project. Voting, of course, that is a tool and technique used as a collect requirements tool in voting. And affinity diagram, you classify based on into categories based on all the ideas that relates to the main high-level idea in the project. And here mainly you have in affinity diagrams, the first level can be used as, for instance, the development life cycle of the project, such as the feasibility phase, and then the feasibility research, and then you will have the design phase, and then you will have the initiation, the planning, the execution, and then the turnover into production, or before turning over into production, the commissioning and startup, and then turning over into transition, or turning over into operations. And then you can classify, that's an example, the related ideas under these categories. Requirements gathering categories. Other categories, you can also gather requirements as a tool and technique. You can also use the below, which we also discussed in the PMI PBA course in details, but we're going to run through at a very high level. You can use them to gather requirements. You have the business requirements, and then you have the stakeholders requirements. These are requirements that are initiated by stakeholders. You have the solution requirements, such as the functional and non-functional requirements, transition requirements such as training, project requirements, requirements related to scope, time, cost, quality, risk, customer satisfaction, quality requirements, technical requirements. So you can use these categories to be able to, as part of the collect and gather requirements process, you can use them as tools and techniques. Mind maps also can be used. Nominal group technique, which we've discussed earlier, it can be used with the brainstorming. Observation, it could be active or passive observation. What I mean by active and passive, passive, you just job shadow a staff in an organization or a stakeholder without intervening in his work or her work. Active observation, you stop him, you try to do the work yourself. It's more interactive, but the disadvantage is that you will delay that stakeholders' work in the organization. That's the disadvantage. Facilitation technique is also used as part of the requirement gathering techniques to be able to achieve consensus. Consensus is the ultimate goal of facilitation. That's the preferred ultimate goal of facilitation. There is autocratic dictatorship technique that doesn't work. There is the majority plurality. Okay, there are different types of facilitation and voting, but the consensus is the ultimate end goal of having everybody agreeing in the room on a decision or on an idea, right, or on a requirement. Context diagram, you have the solution in the middle, and then you have arrows to externals represented in squares. We've also discussed that can also be used that's a very important tool and technique used in requirement gathering. Prototypes also, you demonstrate a working demo. It's not a complete solution, a working demo to the customer, and then that will give a visual representation to the customer of how will the end solution or product would be. Be careful not to confuse. Be careful, be very clear with the customer or the key stakeholders that this is not the working solution. That's only a demo of how the solution would be. Definitely there would be more features. Let's say you are building a website, right? You would show the key stakeholder a skeleton a skeleton website, but that's not the final website of how it's going to be, but just at a very high level how it's going to be, right? That's a prototype. That's an example of a prototype. Balancing stakeholder requirements, we said there are conflicting requirements that need to be balanced and resolved, and this is also part of the requirement gathering. It's not a tool, a technique, but that's concept which I wanted to add here because it's very important to when you are balancing stakeholders' requirements, make sure that you always use as a reference your project charter and your business case. Why? Because this is like a reference where you link all the requirements. So the requirements is what is should be linked to deliverables, forward link to deliverables, and should tie back to a project objective and business objective in the business case and the project charter. So whenever there is a conflict between stakeholders, make sure that this deliverable you are producing ties backward with a requirement, and that requirement ties backward with the business objective and in the business case and the project charter. So use always your business case and the project charter to resolve conflicting requirements. Verify requirements. Of course, requirements need to be verified, as we said, tying forward with deliverables and tying backward with project objectives, and these are mainly represented in the requirement traceability matrix or matrices. Requirement documentation. Output of the collect requirement process must include the acceptance criteria. Okay, so we have said the requirement documentation is the output of the collect requirement process. It must include the acceptance criteria. It uses iterations to make until each requirement satisfies the criteria of being clear, complete, and measurable. Okay, that's crystal clear and very important. That's a very important statement. Requirement traceability matrix, we've discussed it. It ties the project objectives to requirements and deliverables. As part of the defined scope, so we've discussed the requirement gathering. Now, after we elicit, analyze, document the requirements in the requirement documents and the requirement traceability matrix, we want to start defining the scope. We have a clear idea, we have a solid and robust information about the requirements, and here we start the defined scope process in the scope management plan. So the inputs of the defining scope are the project charter, as we said, is the same as the requirements gathering process, scope management plan, of course, the requirement documentation, the assumption log, and the risk register. In defining the scope, time boxing is used. You know, in Agile, you have something called time boxing. So we are all familiar with the triangle: scope, time, and cost, right? So in predictive life cycle projects, you have a fixed scope which you want to deliver in a flexible schedule and budget. That's in traditional and or predictive projects. In adaptive projects, you have a variable scope which you want to deliver in a fixed time and budget. Okay, so that's the difference between that's the time boxing in Agile, and I've provided a further explanation between the predictive approach projects triangle and the adaptive or iterative Agile approach projects. Product analysis also, it's a tool and technique used in defining the scope. Project scope statement, primary output of the defined scope process, and may include the output of the output of defining the scope. The main output, we said we have inputs, we've listed them, tools and techniques such as time boxing and product analysis, and we have the output of the defined scope process, and we have several outputs, among them product scope, project scope including a description, project scope, project boundaries including a description, what is in and what is not in the project, deliverables of the projects, the acceptance criteria, and the assumption and the constraints. So these are all outputs of the defined scope process. Also, we have the scope baseline. In the scope baseline, we have the projects So what comprises the scope baseline is the project statement, project scope statement, work breakdown structure, and WBS dictionary. Scope decomposition, WBS, we have spoken about it. We'll go through the below points. Provides a graphical structured vision of a project. Deliverables are broken down into work package, and the WBS shows their derivation. We have said that. Involves the team and stakeholders to increase buy-in and facilitate communications. That's another advantage of the WBS. Better understand the project and covers all its aspects without any shortfalls, no misses. It helps us define all the gaps in the scope. Helps manage stakeholders' expectations regarding deliverables because everything is properly derived and shown. It helps identifies risks and prevents changes. It provides a basis for estimating resources, cost, and schedule. That's a very important advantage of the WBS. It helps with planning, control efforts, and establishing acceptance criteria for deliverables. Builds the project team and helps people better understand the project. WBS dictionary, it provides a description of the work to be done for each WBS work package and lists the acceptance criteria for each deliverable. It's an output of the create WBS process. Okay? That's crystal clear and very important. I think I've duplicated that slide. Yeah. So validate and control the scope, which is also addressed in the scope management plan. To control the scope, you first need to have a clear definition of the scope. We have said that defining the scope properly will help you controlling that scope. If you have a poor definition of the scope, you will have to control more and more and more all the change requests, and the project will be very cumbersome. Okay. Measure and the completed work against the scope baseline. So here we are talking about the action, not the planning. So we are saying what happens during the validate and control scope. So definitely preventing changes is very important. If you have to do a change, you would have to first of all assess the change. Assessing the change, you would need to evaluate that change and its impact and effect on your project schedule, your scope management plan, your quality management plan, your cost management plan, your human resources, the risk management plan, and your customer satisfaction, and many more, and all your stakeholders. So it's very important to evaluate the change once it is raised. Okay, and the project manager should stomp his feet and should have the authority to say no on projects that affect their finish date. So it's very important. If not, then if it's a critical change which will affect the project and could result in a project failure, then that change should be evaluated. Again, back to the business case, make sure it still ties in with the business objectives and with the company strategy, and make sure that the change control board authorize the change. There are some changes the project manager can execute without referring to the change control board, depending on what he has from authority and plans in his hand. So if there is a change, the project manager assessing that change, it meets the project objective or it meets the business case, and it doesn't impact his other plans, that change can be decided at the project manager level. Okay, but we keep in mind that the project manager is accountable for the project, accountable for its schedule, accountable for its cost. You don't want to be contractually, for instance, what happens at a mega projects or multi-billion dollars projects, the project failure or a mistake or not meeting a deadline will cause huge penalties and a huge amount of money in billions maybe or millions of dollars to be paid as penalties. So it's very critical and very important to know that the project manager is accountable. He is a person that is legally accountable to make sure the project meets all its deadlines, is delivered on budget, with the resources that are planned for, with the minimum risks, meeting customer satisfactions and stakeholder expectations, making sure stakeholder stewardship is undertaken seriously on the project, making sure all the stakeholders are happy, because as part of, I'm diverting a little bit, but just to show the responsibility and the accountability of the project manager and his importance as a project manager role on the project. So the project manager is accountable for the entire project. Okay, and definitely the project manager doesn't want to end up being in jail. so it's very serious and very, very, very important to understand the value of the project manager on the project. Okay, as part of the control and validate scope, measure and complete work against the scope baseline, analyze the variances and determine if the variances are significant enough to warrant changes. If the changes is required, then a change request. That's what we have discussed just now. I think with that we have reached our last presentation. Please focus on that presentation. It gives you a very high overview and the link of the ideas. You can go back and read more about it in PMP 6. You can raise all your questions in the comment box and I will do my best to answer them all. Please make sure also you would read the Rita book, edition 10. Read it in details, do the practice exams and the exercises. Keep on reading, read 3 times that chapter, study it thoroughly once or twice and skim through it the 3rd time. With that, I have reached the final presentation of the scope management. I hope you have enjoyed watching. I hope that was very informative to all of you. If you like that presentation and you want to watch more and get notified each time I upload a new presentation or a video, subscribe to that channel, hit the bell icon, leave your comments, your likes and dislikes, and I will do my best to improve and to be able to meet all your expectations. Together we make a difference, together we learn, together we improve, together we advance, and we build on top of each other ideas. Thank you so much for watching and hope to see you in the next presentation. Bye bye.